So I want to start with some definitions and a very simplistic equation for what we might think about for sustainability, which involves, of course, costs and roles. We've talked about people a lot today. Those costs and roles are pretty critical. Then maximizing both benefits and outrage, which I will focus on. And then moving from usability through to trust and then on to loyalty as a way to promote sustainability via users as opposed to via institutions. So a basic definition, but one that's critical to my thinking. The difference between a product and a project. So at least to me, a product is an item or a service which is offered to address some need or desire or solve some problem within the market, so to speak. Whereas a project is time-bound. Projects have a beginning and an end. And in between the beginning and the end are a set of tasks that are carried out by people in order to achieve some outcome. And that outcome might be the production of a product, but there is a definite distinction between projects and the products that they produce. So what is the product that we're thinking about? What's the project? And where does sustainability fit? Well, given that projects are time-bound, it must surely be the product that we are looking to sustain and not the project. And because it's in the title, you already know this slide. Data is our product, plus the services that make it available. How do we sustain the creation, the updates, the enhancements, the reconciliation of cultural heritage linked open data in a way that is useful, usable, accessible, trustworthy, and engenders loyalty? This is something which I've thought about, but I think is important to put up front here in this sort of introductory section. When we are talking about data, particularly linked open data, the way that I've been thinking about it recently is there are two sets of standards. There's abstraction standards, which I'll talk about that now, and then implementation standards. And they can be quite separate. You can mix and match them. But they are both needed for a product. So the abstraction standards, there must be some sort of conceptual model, some way of thinking about the world in a structured, coherent way that lets us then have a rational discourse about our shared experiences in the world. But that doesn't do any good for computers or inference or searching or querying or anything. So we still need an ontology, which is a way to encode that thinking, that conceptual model, in a way that machines can work with it. And beyond that, we need vocabulary, such that we can have domain-specific discussions. So a physical object could be this podium, it could be this laptop, it could be that screen, or it could be a painting, or it could be a book, or it could be a letter in an archive. And they're all the same raw thing. It's a physical object that I can touch. But in cultural heritage, we care a lot more about paintings than we do about laptops or projectors. So then we need implementation standards. And I think there's two primary sets. There's profiles, or often metadata application profiles, which is a selection of the previous level. So we select appropriate abstractions, put them together to encode the scope of what we want to talk about. So there is many ontologies, many models, zillions of vocabulary items that we could consider. But by specifying a profile of this is what we care about, we've started to make that choice. And Erin and the team have done a great job in picking appropriate ontologies, appropriate vocabularies, and so on in links to that end. But as I'm sure Erin would say, every decision closes doors and introduces bias into the system. However, that's just a specification, right? That's something that humans can read and is needed for the implementation of data, but doesn't give machines any access to that data or to the knowledge. So what we also need is then an API, application programming interface, or as I prefer to call it, it's agreement preceding interaction. Right? We have agreed on how we are going to interact before the interaction, and then it all works nicely. So APIs are a selection of appropriate technologies which then give access to the data in an understandable, agreed upon fashion. So thus, a linked open data product is knowledge in this column, made accessible as data via APIs. And what we want to do is make this product financially sustainable. I am not in any way an ecologist, even much less an ecologist than an economist or a psychologist. So financial sustainability as opposed to making green products, which when you do a search for sustainability on the web in Google, it's really hard to find financial sustainability. Anyway. So here is my entirely simplistic definition of sustainability, or at least a definition that we can use to start to think about a framework for sustainability in this area. So a product is financially sustainable when the running costs, which are huge and real and concrete, is less than the value, which is very not concrete, plus the shutdown costs. And you might think, why the shutdown costs? Well, we'll get to it. I see nods, so aha. So yeah, the costs of stopping operation and the income and the benefits gained through the operation is one side, and the costs of operating is the left-hand side. So how do we balance that to at least zero? Positive would be great, but at least zero. So yeah, the first part is going to be populating the equation on the left-hand side. So there's two categories, I think, of costs. There are resources, being costs to acquire the content, costs for the technology, and then there's activities, and as we've talked about, this is the big one, having sufficient expertise and sufficient just hands on deck to build and maintain and enhance the product is critical. Then events, I'm not really going to talk about, but to explain what I mean, awareness is critical for sustainability of products, and without events, such as conferences and other events managed by the project, it's really hard to know what's happening. It's hard to get users to come and engage. So they're an important aspect that I thought was worth calling out, but one that is hard to factor into an equation. So resources then. And with apologies to OSI, I'm going to steal their interoperability 7 model to some degree. At the base layer, there is hardware. We need machines to run the products on. We need a physical network to move bits over. We need operating systems, so the software which manages the use of the hardware. We need software, so notably a database running in that host operating system. The data, so content managed in the database. And I separate knowledge out from the data. So data, ones and zeros, it can be data, but until you've got the knowledge and the semantics of what those ones and zeros actually mean, who cares? It could just be ones and zeros. Then the API that we've talked about, which is networked access to the knowledge, and then applications built on top of those APIs, which give access to users to the knowledge via the API, which encodes the data running in the database on the operating system, running in the hardware. So the OSI interoperability model, I think, has applications, software, operating systems, and hardware. And I've simply swapped out our domain in the middle. So some likely costs. We're definitely going to build applications. We can't just pick something off the shelf and run it. As opposed to hardware, we're not going to build hardware. We might buy it. We're probably actually going to license it from Compute Canada, or whatever it's called now, or AWS or whatever. So the build versus buy, I think this is build. this is buy, and then there's a continuum down the side there. Licensing is question marks everywhere, I think. Sometimes you can license software or data or APIs or applications. Sometimes you have to buy or build. But at the end, it is somewhat of a zero cost problem. You can't avoid the cost, whether it's building it or licensing it. You can't escape it. And then everything is going to need some degree of maintenance over time, which translates to person time, which translates to dollars. So we at Yale have a project which is similar in nature, but different in scope and different in scale, called Lux, which is to provide cross-collection access to all of our cultural heritage assets. In terms of triples, it's about 2 billion triples. It's about 45 million records in JSON-LD, which use CRM and linked art in the same way that Links does. So our choices were to build the application because it's very custom. We have spent a lot of money also in building the knowledge, the semantics and the data. We've also spent a lot of money both building and licensing software due to scale. We have licensed a product, but at the same time there's a lot of customization needed to get it to do what we want. So we also outsourced the configuration at some hundreds of dollars an hour to an expert who is still with us a long time after we expected everything to be finished. So this is certainly our biggest line item. And of course hardware. When you have billions of triples, you also need substantial computing hardware to run it on. But again, as we've been talking about, the hardware is a relatively quantifiable and easy cost. However, the expertise to use that and maintain it, keep it running, I think can be aligned with that same model. You need someone to keep the hardware running, someone to install operating system updates, someone to look after your software, data engineers to work with the data, semantic engineers to ensure that the modeling is accurate, someone to look after the API, and a front-end engineer to build applications, or hopefully more than one. But with apologies to Bruce Schneier, who proposed some extensions to the OSI model, which I think are actually also useful in this space, there is a layer 8. So if you've heard it's a layer 8 problem, that's the user. So then layer 9 is politics, which if someone says it's a layer 9 problem, run away screaming. And there's also a layer 0, which if you are trying to track down the source of any actual problem with interoperability or hardware or projects, it almost always comes back to some funding requirement somewhere of, oh, we said that we would do this and now we have to do it. Or we said that we want to do this and we didn't get the funding, so we can't do it, so now we're doing this other thing. And we can, of course, add in the roles that are responsible for these layers. So a champion or sponsor, someone to ensure that the funding is available for the project. And then a community manager to look after the users and the politics. And I'm going to run out of space, so let me just shift everything over a little bit. So there is, of course, a core IT team, which is in the middle. And these are roles, not necessarily people. Of course, let me clarify that. I will show you in a couple of slides our person to role matrix. But before that, there is, of course, some other necessary roles. There must be a project manager to look after the team and make sure people are doing the right thing at the right time, that we're sticking to budget, to time, and give the tactics layer to the engineers. And a product owner who can provide strategy and vision for the product, being the data, via the project manager, but also direct with the team as well, hopefully. Then there's a lot of other interactions. So the sponsor can give business requirements to the product owner, who translates it into a strategy or vision. So for example, at Yale, my boss, Susan Gibbons, the Vice Provost for Collections and Scholarly Communication, said, hey, we should do a cross-collection discovery platform. And it should be linked data, and we should do reconciliation. It's like, you know all these words, this is great. So that's the business requirement. And to me as product owner, it's like, all right, how do we translate that into something which folks in ITS who have never heard the words linked data can understand? But of course, if we're to have sustainability, we need to take into account user requirements. And the product owner is not going to go and talk to every single user. That would take a long time. So having some community management is essential. Of course, the project manager should also feedback project-based requirements. You know, hey, we don't have time to do X, or here is a list of things that we could do, pick 2. And once there is a product with services, a business analyst to provide metrics of usage back to the product owner to say, okay, this is what we thought would be the case. You know, this is the usage we expected. Here is what's actually happening. What do we do? What do we do now? So this then requires a bunch of expertise in different domains, and here is one of the issues I would say with linked data in terms of sustainability. There's a lot of overlap where the expertise is needed in order to have a successful outcome. So in terms of the audience domain, right, the UI folks need to understand the audience, but also really, if the data doesn't meet the audience's needs, you've got a problem. So you could kind of put yellow all the way down. But it certainly overlaps those top few. The application needs to be usable by the audience, it needs to use the APIs, it needs to give access to the knowledge. So if the UI engineer doesn't understand the domain at all, there's going to be a steep learning curve for them. The domain, of course, focuses around the knowledge and data layers, but extends up into the APIs and to a little bit down into the software, then the systems, and leadership at the bottom. So when we tried to apply this diagram to our system at Yale, we could fill in a lot of the gaps, but we realized instantly we do not have a community manager. We don't have actual users because we haven't come out of development yet, so we don't need a community manager today, but there isn't one written into the project. We do not have funding for it, so we're going to have to scrape together something in that space. But yeah, we use AWS for hardware and operating system, and we have a sysadmin who does the updates. Brent is our lovely, expensive consultant for the product. Very knowledgeable, but yeah, thankfully, very knowledgeable. Song takes 2 roles, right? He's here and here. Looks after the software layers. Kelly, who is a new report to me, and I do data engineering. I do the sort of knowledge mapping, and Cameron is our front-end engineer. We have a great project manager called Sarah. I'm also the product owner, and we do not have a business analyst, but that we can get from ITS just by, can we have 10% of a person, please? Okay, sure. So thankfully, we don't have a name, but that one's a much easier problem than the higher question marks. Okay, so we've talked about people, we've talked about content and technology to some degree. Don't underestimate, well, I'm sure you're not, the costs of acquiring content, both in terms of building it and licensing and etc. So, value on the other side of the equation. Income, well, there's actual dollars in a bank that can be spent, and there's in-kind support, and then there's intangible value that can be produced by the product. And then the shutdown costs, I think, are pretty much the same as the intangible value, just flipped on their head. Income, yeah, right. I mean, yes. So for a project, yes, we can get grants, but it's not a sustainable solution, right? So it's time bound. Project funding from within the house, same problem, right? You always have to say, can we please have some more money? Can we please have some more money? Can we please have some more money? And eventually, the institution very rightly says no. Subscription or other membership models is also very hard to build. There's a few occurrences where it has worked well. Wikidata, even, you could kind of say the begging is a subscription model, or NPR, at least in the States. But Archive and AAAF have subscription models, but they are the very few projects. And then organizations, general allocation, which basically is the same as in-kind support, right? The organization has said, this is a good thing for us, we will put people towards it. It doesn't matter where those people are paid from, which cost center, if they're working on the project, really. So the bottom line really is, the organization must support the product. And if it doesn't, there's trouble. And for the organization to support the product must advance the organization's mission. I know this is blatantly obvious, but it's worth spelling out. If the product is something irrelevant to the organization, then there is no way they're going to put money into it. So how do we justify why links, in this case, or why the linked data product is relevant to the university or is relevant to the consortia? So Lux's income for the project, we have 2 grants, one from the Mellon Foundation for reconciliation, which pays for me and some students and some hardware, and one from the NEH around exhibitions, which is a very, very small drop in the bucket. Project funding, we have an internal CHIT, which is a terrible acronym which I will not pronounce because for obvious reasons. So the Cultural Heritage Information Technology Project is a 5-year Yale project to work across ITS and the cultural heritage sector. We don't have subscription, but the organization's in-kind support is huge in comparison to all of the other sources of funding. So yeah, again, the organization must engage with, invest in, and feel ownership of the product. And the links, is the product links, or is it components of links that can be separated out amongst institutions? Well, something we could talk about. Then there's intangible benefits, which of course don't end up on ledgers, but are super important to call out to stakeholders and sponsors. So I think there's 4 primary ones. Does it advance the mission? And for us all, I believe, that would be research, teaching and learning, and then general awareness in the population of the cultural knowledge that we curate. Does it fulfill stakeholder needs? Does it allow search, discovery, access, and other interaction with the content? Are there cost savings that can be leveraged, which I have put under intangible, because it's really hard to quantify how much of a saving there is. But, for example, economies of scale can be very important, right? If everyone is building a reconciliation engine, then we are wasting a ton of money. How much value each institution is saving by not building it is really hard to tell. And then second degree benefits. Internal culture change is a critical one, I think. How does the product and project change the way that we think about our work? Can it improve related products? And ticket sales, we're not actually selling tickets, but what are the second degree financial benefits of doing the product, building the product, doing the project, that you can point to help justify why the product's important. I feel a little bit ill even when I was writing the words, but this fulfills my buzzword quotient for the entire slide deck. So what's important is to demonstrate mission critical stakeholder impact, which sounds terrible and like someone in a black suit and pink shirt would say in front of a crowd of similarly dressed folks. But I think the important part really is, it's mission critical, right? How does it advance the mission of the organization? It must be demonstrated. You have to be able to prove that it does that. Stakeholders are important, right? If it's just for our own benefit, if we're only advancing ourselves, if we're only helping ourselves, no one's going to continue to pay for it. And impact, what is the impact? How can we measure it, if at all? Or at least wave our hands around and say, look, this has had a big impact on our important stakeholders. So we think for Lux that we can tick all of these boxes. It advances the mission of the university, which is, of course, teaching and learning, and it advances the mission of the Scholarly Communication and Cultural Heritage Division, because our boss said, you should do this, and we're doing it. It fulfills stakeholder needs. Cross-collection discovery is painful, always, and we are very close to being able to demonstrate a performant and user-friendly way of implementing that using linked open data. We do not have any direct cost savings, but we certainly have them via our second degree products, which are huge. A cultural change, we have been fortunate somewhat in the timing of this work coming during the pandemic. So previously there was a reluctance to talk even between the art gallery and the Centre for British Art, even though they're in exactly the same domain. They're just across the street and they go out to lunch all the time, but they didn't share workflows or tools or anything. And yes, don't get me started about the library being an entire island all to itself. So by having a collaborative product or collaborative project, building a coherent, connected product, it's been really helpful to get people to work together because they have to. And in doing so, they've found that, hey, this is actually really good. We can go across the street, or we can virtually go across the street via Zoom because really we're all in our houses during the pandemic. Or we can talk to people who are doing similar things to what we are doing in the same organization, just in a different part of the division. The shared expertise building has been critical as well. As I said earlier today, ITS are kind of looking at our central IT folks are looking at this project and thinking, well, how can we use graphs? How can we use knowledge graph technology in other ways now that we've built this expertise in-house? And we can reuse the technology. Once you've got a graph system that's performant and people understand it, all right, now we'll clone it, put different data in, much faster, much easier, much cheaper to do the second project rather than the first. Reuse of data and services, this is actually a really big one. So both the Art Gallery and the Peabody Museum of Natural History are looking to redo their collection websites. And they're not going to do it by themselves. In fact, they're going to throw away all of their solar and other infrastructure and just use the linked data subset using the full cross-collection discovery platform and say, hey, we want to have something like Lux, something like that, but just for us. And we'll customize it. Now we can add some more domain-specific knowledge that isn't appropriate in a cross-collection environment, but is important within a single institution or a single museum. And then, of course, awareness and reputation. We've already had a dozen organizations come to us to say, how have, and it's not public, we haven't released it, we haven't done anything yet, it's just by word of mouth. How have you done this? What products are you using? How did you set this up? We have this, we see this problem coming like a freight train, and we would really love to not be on the tracks when the freight train gets to us. So we're, again, we're extremely privileged at Yale, both in terms of having the cultural richness. So, maximizing users and usage. So more applications equals more usage, equals more users, equals more outrage for it if it were to be shut down. So if we expand from one application using the data via the APIs to 5, then surely we have a cajillion more users, all of whom will be outraged and write nasty letters to the university saying, hey, we really loved this thing and you've taken it away. Or how do we get to become too big to fail? Which, according to Econopedia or something, is a system which is deemed to be so deeply ingrained in an economy that its failure would be disastrous to that economy, or landscape, or ecosystem. Or a product which is so deeply ingrained that if we were to take it away, the whole ecosystem would just collapse. So I think there are some desirable features for sustainability which you can predict, knowing me and maybe having heard a talk of mine in the past 5 to 10 years. The data should be linked, of course, right? If it's not connected to other data, if it's not connected via multiple systems, then it can't be ingrained, right? It's just a standalone product. So there must be connections in and there must be connections out. It should be open. We shouldn't have limitations on access or use of the data because then we're limiting the number of users and the possible usage. It should be usable. If it's not usable, no one's going to use it. QED. And data, which is of course the product. So what we should be looking for is linked, open, usable data as opposed to just linked data. So then, what is data usability? This is my one copied slide from previous talks. So this is the Wikipedia definition of usability. Usability is the degree to which a thing, the product, can be used by specified consumers, so who, to achieve their quantified objectives, what, with effectiveness, efficiency and satisfaction, how, in a quantified context of use, or conceptually, where. In other words, usability is not dependent on the data. Usability is dependent on the audience. We do not say this data is usable. We put out data, we make it available, the audience uses it, they tell us if it's usable or not. And there are some design principles for usability. All right, 2 slides that I've copied. Which these come from the AAAF work, and we have borrowed and adapted them slightly in the linked arts work. I won't go through them all. But I would like to call out 3 and 4 in particular. Make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. If people have to learn complex theories in order to use the data, they won't. And make the easy things easy and the complex things possible. So if it's easy to have a name and easy to find the name and easy to display the name to the user via the web, great. And if it's possible to have uncertain attributions and blah, 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 blah in different contexts and who thinks that at what time, well, great. And if people don't implement that straight away, okay, it's probably not the end of the world. Note, in this order, the linked data stuff is actually quite close to the bottom in terms of 1 to 10. And clarified with when possible, right? Usage is great. Usage is more important than perfection and absolute adherence to semantics, in my opinion. I'm a data pragmatist. So then, how do we engage with users? What do we need to do to get users to use the product? And in order to get them to come back, they will need to trust the product. So a couple of definitions before I put them together in a diagram. Utility is the belief of the consumer that the data is useful for fulfilling their current information need. Right? So this is useful to me now. Confidence is the belief of the consumer in the current and past competence of the data publisher, e.g. the data is accurate. This organization knows what they're doing when they publish data. And then trust, separate from confidence, is forward-looking. It's the belief of the consumer in the current and future benevolence of the publisher, e.g. that they will continue to make accurate data available for use in an open, usable way. Right? So sustainability and trust are deeply, deeply linked. So here is the basic layer. And the user has some information need. They go to the data. The data, to some degree, is accurate in describing the cultural heritage, knowledge, be it an asset or other. There is some certainty of the institution in their description. The user is confident based on the past competence of the organization and has some degree of trust about the future benevolence that the organization will continue to make that data available to them. But when we're talking about usability of data, who is the audience? Is it the researcher? No. Researchers don't use data, normally, unless you're Matt Lincoln or similar, or Constance, or other DH software engineer-y type. Instead, there is some software engineer who is implementing some application on top of the APIs which give access to the knowledge which is encoded as data. Right? There is this stack that I brought up earlier. So the end user only actually sees the data through the lens of the application. So the user of the data is the person who develops the application. The user of the application is the one who we normally think of as the user. So what does that do to the trust diagram? I think it breaks it. Right? So we have usability. The client developer thinks that the data is usable. But this utility line goes to the data. Well, that's not right. The utility, or is this useful to me, is seen by the researcher through the lens of the application. So the utility is dependent on the usability of the data. And trust is dependent on utility over time. Right? If something is not useful to the person over time, then they're not going to come back. If the data is not usable, then the user is not going to think that it's useful. They might not understand it. They certainly are not going to come back. And the cost in the top right-hand institution, right, is going up for essentially no reason. So we need trust, but just trust isn't sufficient for outrage, and outrage is what we're trying to get to, right? So why would the user be outraged at product closure? Or how do we create an emotional connection rather than just trust in the benevolence of the big multi-billion-dollar endowed university? So is the product fun? Maybe. Gamification is certainly a thing, certainly a way of keeping users and engaging with them. Is it rewarding? Right? Is there some continual positive feedback? Or does it advance the user's personal goals somehow? Right? These are all straight out of brand awareness blogs, which I forced myself to struggle through. Or how do we build brand loyalty to a linked open data product? So to then tie this back into trust and usability, I think there's two factors. Right? There's the user community at one side, and there's the product, which is data at the top. And we can assert a increasing scale for both of these, and they tie together, which to me as a framework person is elegant, so it must be right. So data can be usable, and the user community can have awareness of the product, at which point we end up with usage. Right? But beyond just being usable, the data can be accurate. At which point, if the user community is the right community to be engaging with, it will hopefully meet their needs. At which point, the user community is satisfied. Right? There is not just usage, but there is satisfaction with the product, right? This is, they came along, it wasn't what they wanted, they went away. This is, they came along, it was what they wanted, hopefully they come back. If the product is persistent, or sustainable, and it's updated, then we can start to move ahead. At which point, there's also a reputation for the product or the institutions in the community. At which point now we can start to get to trust. And I should say, we can't get to the next level until we have both of these sides, right? If you have relevant and personal, but not whatever's going to appear there, then you're only stuck with trust. So I think the next layer is the data has to be relevant to the user to have any sort of meaning to the user. It needs to be somehow personal, right? They should see themselves in the product, even if they weren't contributing to it, but they should see this is relevant to me as a person rather than a researcher or as an employee. So then, for the user community, there needs to be engagement, right, which involves interpersonal connections and relationships, even if it's via a web feedback form, right? But there has to be something that says, we as an institution recognize you as a user as being valuable and part of our work. At which point, we hope to generate attachment, right? Which is still not loyalty. So one of the, to my horror, most sustainable linked open data products around the place is Wikidata, right? I have severe doubts about this layer, but it's interactive, right? And if you make a comment on Twitter, which I have, about the lack of accuracy or otherwise any feelings of negativity about Wikidata, you will very quickly find out how loyal Wikidata fanatics are. So why? This is what I spent the most time thinking about. Why is Wikidata so objectively inaccurate and still loved? Because we can do better. We can be both accurate and loved, hopefully. So I think it's interactive, and I don't mean interactive via the user application. I mean interactive with the data somehow, right? Wikidata engenders loyalty because the user is the product, as with many free big systems, right? It's how does the Wikimedia Foundation get people to give them data to sell to corporations or license to corporations? How do they get people to do that for free so that they can then turn around and make a profit? Well, to become financially sustainable by licensing that data onwards. So we're not going to do that, I hope. But we do, I think, need some degree of interactivity with the data and the user. At which point, I think there is the support of the user community as opposed to just engagement with the product. And now, this is when we have loyalty, as opposed to just usage, satisfaction, trust, or engagement. So of course, we can put these into buckets. We're metadata folks, catalogers, we like to categorize. So the first one is functional, right? It's just they came, they did something, they maybe went away, they maybe came back. There's no significant engagement. The middle two are intellectual, right? We don't need to feel any emotional attachment to trust something. We can assess it intellectually. And then the green box is the emotional one, at which point we've got them hooked. Right? We can rely on their support should we need their outrage. So, some concluding thoughts, which Susan has nicely spoilt for me earlier today, that essentially people is the common theme through all of these areas, right? We need people to build and operate the product. They need to be in different, the right roles, the right people. That's expensive because of the technology, the intersection of the technology and the domain. There's not that many cultural heritage linked open data experts that you can just hire to build your system. We need people to champion and invest in the product within the institution to say this is something which does fulfill our mission, which does advance our goals, and get the funding from wherever. If it's project funding, if it's internal general allocation, or if it's internal project funding, right? Hopefully we get to the GA side before the project funding runs out. And people to use and love the product, right? If we don't have users, then we don't have a product. So, much like interoperability and Soylent Green, sustainability, I would say, is made of people. Thank you very much for your attention.